Hello everybody, welcome back. My name is Camila Torres. I am the instructor for this course, and the course is CEDC 705 and CEDC 705.5, Mathematics Curriculum and Methods. This video will address how children learn math. In our last video, we talked about how the pendulum swung since 1920s, through the 50s, through the 60s with new math, through the Back to Basics program in the Nixon and the beginning of the Reagan era, and then Reagan pushing it over to looking at other ways to teach mathematics based on educational psychology and what we know about even biology and morality in humans, and applying these ideas to the teaching of everything. But in this class, we're going to talk about mathematics. The shifts in the classroom went from what you would consider this kind of typical traditional classroom where students were just individuals inside a classroom. It wasn't a community. The classroom wasn't a community. The teacher was a sole authority that would decide if her answer is correct or incorrect, rather than the students making a decision based on logical statements, arguments made by their peers to defend their ideas or their answers, their techniques. Previously, we went from just mere memorization of procedures towards using mathematical reasoning to understand why certain procedures exist and how they happen to come about, how they actually happen to evolve, what they mean. Similar, they went from sort of a mechanistic finding of answers, where they would just follow a pattern and be able to just sort of magically come up with the answer, rather than conjecturing, coming up with trial and error ways to find results. And then, instead of treating mathematics as just a bunch of isolated concepts, so like fractions are completely different than division, the idea in the 80s, as they started to shift, were starting to look for connections in mathematics, how things are connected, not just in the grade level, but also vertically, looking at how something like dividing things into groups extends as early as maybe second grade, when students are just starting to learn fractions, through long division, rational expressions, etc. So that they're understanding that this is a major theme or major idea, instead of just long division is one thing and fractions are another. So really trying to help students see where connections are within mathematics, where perhaps in the past they had been described as completely different objects. When we think about what influences a student's ability to attain a concept, really you're talking about cognitive development and cognitive psychology. And in mathematics instruction, we really lean on the work of 2 or 3 major players. And I'm going to discuss that now. So the first person that I want to talk about very briefly is John Dewey, who is one of the first who is widely credited with incorporating psychology into teaching and learning. John Dewey believed that learning was active and schooling unnecessarily long and restrictive, and he rejected the notion that schools should focus on repetitive rote memorization and a proposed method of directed living. So like direct instruction, in other words. His idea was that children came to school to do things and live in a community which gave them real guided experiences, which fostered their capacity to contribute to society. In school, students would engage in real-world practical workshops in which they would demonstrate their knowledge through creativity and collaboration. Students should be provided with opportunities to think for themselves and articulate their own thoughts. Dewey called for education to be grounded in real-life experience. Jean Piaget was deeply rooted in classical antiquity, Socratic seminars, dialogue with his followers. He believed in a dialogue with children and asked directed questions that led his students to realize for themselves the weaknesses in thinking, sort of like a Socratic seminar type of situation. He also believed that learning is an active and not a passive process where knowledge should be constructed and not acquired. Knowledge construction is based on personal experiences and the continual testing of hypotheses. Each person has a different interpretation and construction of the knowledge process based on past experience and cultural factors, and so it can vary. Apart from his learning theories, Piaget's theory of constructivism addresses how learning actually occurs and does not only focus on what influences learning. Piaget's theory of constructivism argues that people produce knowledge and form meaning based on their experiences. Piaget's theory covered learning theories, teaching methods, and educational reform. Two key components which create the construction of an individual's new knowledge are assimilation and accommodation. Assimilation causes an individual to incorporate new experiences into old experiences. This causes the individual to develop new outlooks, rethink what was once misunderstandings, and evaluate what is important, ultimately altering their perceptions. Accommodation is reframing the world and new experiences into the mental capacity already present. Individuals conceive a particular fashion in which the world operates. When things do not operate within that context, they must accommodate or reframe the expectations with the outcomes. The role of teachers is very important. Instead of giving a lecture, teachers in this theory function as facilitators whose role is to aid the student when it comes to their own learning. This takes away focus from the teacher and lecture and puts it upon the student and their learning. Resources and lesson plans that must be initiated for this learning theory take a very different approach towards traditional learning as well. Instead of telling, the teacher must begin asking. Instead of answering questions that only align with their curriculum, the facilitator in this case must make it so that the student comes to the conclusions on their own instead of being told. Also, teachers who are continually in conversations with students, creating their learning experience that is open to new directions, depending upon the needs of the student as the learning progresses. Teachers following Piaget's theory of constructivism must challenge the student by making them effective critical thinkers and not merely by being a teacher, but also a mentor, a consultant, and a coach. So in this image, we kind of can see sort of a visual representation of the differences between assimilation and accommodation. In assimilation, on the left, a child would learn what a dog is. Then they see some new four-legged creature and they call it a dog. This happens to be correct. We can refer to this as inductive reasoning. This is useful and encourages children in observation. Accommodation would occur when a child interacts with a new four-legged thing that is not a dog. In this example, a child calls a cat a dog simply because it has four legs. When they realize that the generalization cannot be made to all four-legged things, accommodation is complete. An example in high school mathematics would be a proof. So, a proof is a logical argument that establishes beyond any doubt that something is true everywhere and for eternity. Unlike inductive reasoning, as in the previous slide, proofs require deductive reasoning. For deductive reasoning, you start from a general statement you know that for sure is true and draw conclusions about a specific case. For example, just keeping with the animal theme, if you know for a fact that all sheep like to eat grass, and you also know for a fact that the creature standing in front of you is a sheep, then you know that it must like to eat grass, for sure, most certainly. This form of reasoning is watertight. It can only go wrong if your premise is false. That is, if you're wrong about sheep liking grass, or if your observation is wrong and the creature you're looking at is not actually a sheep. But if those two things are correct, then your conclusion follows necessarily from your premise. It is true everywhere and for eternity. Mathematics is perhaps the only field in which absolute certainty is possible, which is why mathematicians hold proofs so dearly. Also, if we don't insist on proofs, mistakes can creep in that aren't easily spotted otherwise. High school emphasizes proofs in geometry as one of the first experiences a student has with deductive reasoning. Students often struggle with proofs, so researchers have tried to understand why through educational psychological studies. In a recent study in the International Education Studies Journal, they attempted to apply Piaget's ideas to students' errors. Researchers found one of the following was true in their study for students that were having problems with proofs. Number one, either the student did not have the prior knowledge to assimilate or accommodate their understanding. Number two, they did not realize that the previous knowledge could not be accommodated correctly, or there were unrelated errors. The conclusion that can be drawn from this research is that the failure of proof construction can occur due to either the incompleteness of the schema knowledge of students when they are attempting to assimilate, or the incomplete accommodation without sufficient reflection, or that they have a complete schema, but they're attempting to apply it erroneously to the new proof. In essence, they are overgeneralizing their understanding, or their schema, I guess. Another one of Piaget's contributions were the stages of cognitive development. Piaget's stages of development are not fixed terms. So while, for example, the pre-operational stage is considered to be between 2 and 7 years, it could be earlier or it could be delayed. These are very flexible start and end points for each one of these stages. In fact, what we know now is that many students will not reach the formal operational stage until much later than 12, while a few reach it as early as 10. As elementary school teachers, we won't work so much with the sensory motor stage, but the pre-operational stage and the concrete operational stage are important to fully understand as we're trying to help students understand abstract concepts. In a lot of situations, students will be fighting against their own cognitive stage in order to fully understand what they're trying to learn in school. With that said, what I would like for you to do real quick is to pause this video here. I'm going to ask you to watch a video clip that summarizes Piaget's stages of development. You can watch the video clip several ways. If you have the Google Slides open, you can simply click on the link on this slide. If you're watching this on YouTube, you will find the link below. Or if you're watching this on Blackboard, you'll be able to go over to the menu in the weekly module page and click on the link directly there. Once you've finished watching the video clip, please return to this video. So the next person we're going to talk about is Lev Vygotsky. I'm sure if you've been in a teaching program for any level of time, you've heard about him. So he rejected the assumption made by Piaget that it was possible to separate learning from its social context. So he's known for the social cultural theory for that reason. Vygotsky's theory stressed the fundamental role of social interaction in the development of cognition, as he believed strongly that community plays a central role in the process of making meaning. The emphasis is on a collaborative nature of learning and the importance of cultural and social contexts. All cognitive functions are believed to originate in and are explained as products of social interactions. Learning is more than the assimilation of new knowledge by learners. It was the process by which learners were integrated into a knowledge community. He believed that constructivists such as Piaget had overlooked the essentially social nature of language, and consequently failed to understand that learning is actually a collaborative process. In terms of main differences, Vygotsky places more emphasis on culture affecting cognitive development. Second, he places considerably more emphasis on social factors contributing to cognitive development. Vygotsky states that cognitive development stems from social interactions, from guided learning within the zone of proximal development, and that which is the space in which learning occurs, thus where teaching needs to be situated, as children and their partners co-construct knowledge. In contrast, Piaget maintained that cognitive development stems largely from independent explorations in which children construct knowledge of their own. Third, Vygotsky places more and different emphasis on the role of language in cognitive development. So the zone of proximal development is the space of potential learning. It can be defined as the distance between the actual developmental level as determined by independent problem solving and the level of potential development as determined through problem solving under guidance or in collaboration with more capable peers. Vygotsky believed that when a student is in the zone of proximal development, or ZPD, for a particular task, provided the appropriate assistance will give the student enough of a boost to achieve the task. To assist a person to move through the zone of proximal development, educators are encouraged to focus on 3 important components which aid the learning process. First, there should be a presence of someone with knowledge and skills beyond that of the learner, so the more knowledgeable other. Second, social interactions with a skilled tutor that allow the learner to observe and practice their skills. And third, scaffolding or supportive activities provided by the educator or more competent peer to support the student as they are led through the zone of proximal development. Vygotsky's sociocultural perspective also included his theory of language and thought. Vygotsky's theory of thought and language is culturally and environmentally based. He offers a theoretical framework applicable to child development, schools, and applied learning. In Vygotsky's philosophy, language plays a central role in the theory of human cognitive development. Language plays multiple roles, including culturally shaping the overt behavior of individuals, as well as influencing their covert behavior, such as thinking. Language shapes our mind, while at the same time, language shapes our social interactions and relationships. Looking at Vygotsky's work, there's a lot that we can implement into math instruction. First, we want math instruction to be active and not passive learning. We need to know what students understand, so assess what is known, and estimate their capability of working independently and with our help or the help of one of their peers. Guided participations need to be structured by teachers who actually turn over more and more of the activity to students. This slow release of support is called scaffolding. We also want students to engage in cooperative learning activities so that they can help each other. During this time, we want students engaging in speech. So we want them talking to one another. We know that this is an important tool not only in their social development, but also in their cognitive development. The more we know about cognitive and developmental psychology, the more we have to sort of keep in mind. So we just talked about a lot of different ideas that go into good learning, and they're all empirically based, meaning that these theories are the accepted pathway that we understand students to develop, especially at a young age. Not only are these theories accepted in the field of education, but they're also accepted in the fields of medicine and psychology, like in psychological training, counseling, etc. When we're looking at cognitive psychology, really looking at the ideas of Piaget and Vygotsky, what's the best way to balance these? Do you take one versus another? In my opinion, I think what you do is you try different things. You give a mix of students being able to work independently, students being able to work in groups. I think in my opinion, and this is just my opinion at this point, all groups all the time is not always effective. And can sometimes, even if you have students that are more introverted, can cause even more stress to the point where they're feeling as though it might even prohibit their learning. So I think that in order to meet the needs of all our students, which is what we're constantly trying to do, I think when you're creating your lessons, when you're thinking about how you're going to present things, in my opinion, I would look sort of for the big idea, the rationale of why students need to learn what you want to teach them, and what things can be made available to the students that they can work independently, work in social groups, giving them choice, giving them support, allowing them to voice their beliefs either through writing, through paper. As we can see, you could even do it via video or a podcast or something. So bringing these together in a way that works for your students is really important. It doesn't have to be all or nothing. There is no absolute framework that will work for everybody. So I think that the blending of these and giving students exposure to this is really best. So we've just spent some time discussing how do students learn. We talked about a constructivist way of teaching and exposing students to experiences that would allow them to obtain knowledge through various factors, through speech, through manipulatives, through exploration. But how do we know when knowledge is actually acquired? I want to point out one specific word here that we're going to talk about in detail throughout the rest of this course. And this word is the word understand. In 2000, the NCTM came out with the following statement. In this changing world, those who understand and can do mathematics will have significantly enhanced opportunities and options for saving their futures. Mathematical competence opens doors to productive futures. A lack of mathematical competence keeps those doors closed. Now, I wanted to point out the word understand for a couple different reasons. First one we're going to talk about today. For our course, I wanted to find the construct of understanding. And for our course, we're going to define understanding can be defined as a measure of the quality and the quantity to connections that an idea has with existing ideas. So really looking at the Piagetian idea of how does new knowledge fit into existing knowledge, how has it been able to be accommodated as necessary or assimilated as necessary, and how correct are those connections. The other thing that we're going to add to this definition is that understanding is not all or nothing. And finally, that understanding is dependent on existing ideas. So again, according to Piaget, knowledge is acquired. Knowledge will hook on to schemas in order for it to be acquired properly. So depending on the quality of the schemas, that will depend on how well someone does or does not understand. One of the definitions that we used to define the construct of understanding is that understanding is not all or nothing. In this way, we can think of understanding as a continuum. On one side, we have relational understanding, where new learning has attached itself to schema and expanded the understanding of the knowledge. Right? This is where we want them to be. On the complete opposite side of the continuum is instrumental understanding. This type of learning is very low-level learning, where things are just maybe memorized. They're insular facts that just sort of exist, that they're not connected to anything. There's no meaning behind it. All that learning is out of context. And so that type of learning does not stay within the learner's mind for any long period of time. As I said, we need to strive for our students to have relational understanding. So as they progress through their study of mathematics, everything that they learn is seen as a connection, not as necessarily something that they learned in the last chapter, but something that they've experienced in the past. So for example, if we're looking at addition, perhaps they should see subtraction as the inverse of addition. Perhaps they should see multiplication as repeated addition. So all these connections go back as far as they can to the very primary fundamental points of mathematics education, the things that they learned in kindergarten, things like counting, number recognition, beginning to add, the idea of putting together. Learners need time to make these connections. So what can happen when concepts are not fully understood? So here's another opportunity for you to pause my video, and you're going to get a chance to watch an Abbott and Costello clip. You can access the clip in the same way as you accessed the last clip. If you have your Google Doc open, you can simply click on the link. If you're on YouTube, go ahead and pause this video and look for the link in the description box below. If you're on Blackboard, go to the Blackboard menu and look for the page for the Abbott and Costello link in the weekly module. When you've finished the clip, please return to this point in my video. So what happened in the clip? Costello was able to take advantage of the fact that his landlord did not understand the meaning of place value. He got confused because perhaps he had just relied on procedures in the past. However, he did have some sort of sense that the number was incorrect, he just did not know why. So he did not have full relational understanding. In order to help students achieve relational understanding, we lean on the concepts of educational psychology. In mathematics, one of the key ways that we're able to use educational psychology in the teaching of mathematics is using conceptual math instruction techniques. There are 3 stages of conceptual math instruction techniques: the concrete phase, the representational phase, and the abstract phase. While this diagram may make it seem as though these are a linear progression, it's not unusual for students to flip-flop from one stage to another, and also the time that they spend in each of those phases may vary greatly from student to student. They go from a concrete phase where students are using manipulatives to a representational phase where students are drawing or creating their own representation of the manipulative, sort of showing with diagrams or whatever it is how they're thinking in their own way. And then finally going to the abstract representation where numbers and symbols are used to show the learning. As I said, I am a firm believer that there is no one way to teach mathematics. Although my experience has been with concrete representation abstract techniques, or CRA techniques, and I've had a lot of success with that. That does not mean that I have not ever gone to direct instruction route, to other types of pedagogy to meet the needs of my learners. I highly recommend that you adapt your own teaching, regardless of what it is, to provide some level of CRA instruction to your students. In the concrete stage of CRA techniques, the students are using manipulatives, and here in the corner you can see all kinds. There's tons of manipulatives. You can buy real math manipulatives, but you can also use things that you can find around the house. I've seen Post-its, I've seen things like just dried beans, I've seen toothpicks. Whatever they have that they can actually manipulate with their hands is what we want students to do. Students would use the manipulatives themselves, and that manipulative could either represent a quantity or an idea. If the manipulative is meant to represent an idea, the teacher must define the representation. The item should be made readily available for students to use until they want to let them go. This idea of allowing students to use manipulatives until they're ready to release them is a point of controversy. Again, in my opinion, in my experience with teaching mathematics at the elementary school level, I let the students use manipulatives as much as they needed to. I encouraged them to move away from them from time to time, but they were always there in case they needed to make sense of something on their own and they needed the manipulative to do so. The most important thing, especially when you're dealing with parents, is to establish that manipulatives are not a crutch or an adjustment made for different types of learners. They're a tool. They're educational tools that are used to make sure that students are able to see and touch and visually experience mathematics instead of trying to do all these abstract ideas in their heads. The next stage is the representational stage. Unfortunately, the representational stage is often the one that gets skipped or glossed over, but it's really important. During the representational stage, the students create another representation to mean the same as the manipulative. It could be just drawing the manipulatives, it could be cutting things out of paper, making their own manipulatives, coming up with something that's analogous that reminds them of what they used for the manipulatives. But ultimately what it's doing is it's giving students time to reflect. During this reflection phase is when they are starting to assimilate and accommodate those ideas in their minds. Pairing these type of activities up with other students so that they can share their work, how they can explore how other people have done the same type of work, how others view the work, is very, very important. Another thing that's really great about this stage too is it gives students a connection between art, mathematics, but also writing. Having students also write about what's happening in the mathematics is just as important. This is also a great time to tie in something like a book, some sort of children's literature that is aligned with your instruction so that they can see yet another way that people are using those same concepts in various disciplines. The last stage is the abstract stage. The abstract stage is probably the way that you were taught math, where you would just use traditional symbols, you would read, write, and use these symbols to solve the problems, and you would actually extract information and communicate your findings or your answers with other symbols. Symbols are important. Being able to do calculations in a fluid way, an efficient way, is very important. However, when we're dealing with children, we really want to keep this stage as something that students work up to instead of exposing them to the abstract phase from the very beginning. One thing to note is that the CRA stage can be used from pre-K all the way up to 12th grade. Every single concept that exists in mathematics between pre-K all the way up to even AP calculus or something has corresponding manipulatives. Now, manipulatives are expensive. If this is something that you really feel is worthwhile, if you've ever been put in a position where your AP or your principal says, you know what, I really want you to take over looking at the math curriculum, what can we do to support our students? Start looking at ways that you can support students using math manipulatives, and then also start to develop some PD for that. There's all kinds of things that can be done. Again, anything that's educational is going to be expensive. If you go to an education store and you try to buy math manipulatives, they're going to be much more expensive than something that you can use around the house, like paper clips or toothpicks or dried beans or whatever it is that you can find. I've seen it all. You're just really limited by your imagination. Maybe it's not something you do in your first or second year of teaching, trying to kind of reinvent the wheel. Give yourself a little time to see what are the needs of your class, what are the needs of your school, where is it that you can use manipulatives to scaffold, because ultimately that's what we're doing. The manipulatives are there as a scaffold. Students will let go of that scaffold on their own. One way to encourage the removal of that scaffold is to forcing them into the representational phase, telling them to color, telling them to draw, telling them to write. And once that becomes too much, then we go into the abstract phase. By allowing students to see the abstract phase like a shorthand way of communicating what would take them a long time to draw or to write out, they're seeing the value of the abstract stage, and they are also acquiring meaning from the symbols. So we kind of talked about how all these stages would work together to support and achieve understanding. We've got the manipulatives right here. We've got pictures where students can draw in the representational phase. If we can have them working in groups where they can use oral language, that makes it even a stronger activity or a stronger lesson. Slowly, we're going to move them into written symbols so that they can see the usefulness of the shorthand of the symbols. And in the next lecture, we're going to talk about strategies that we use in order to help students adapt mathematics and use mathematics for real-world situations. So that's it for today's lecture. See you at the next one. Bye!